churches make, I always call them complements. I remember my first congregation when we endeavored to do a building project and add on to our school. Our school, we just had too many kiddos, and so we had combined grades, and we just couldn't keep them combined. We had to bust them out, but we had no space. So we undertook this building project, which if you've ever endured a building project at a congregation, they can be trying things. This is when you long for the hierarchy of a Catholic church, because in the Catholic church, the project manager just works with the priest, and whatever the priest says goes, and the people just live with it. At a Lutheran church, since the people are in charge, the contractor works with a committee, and every decision has to get made by a committee, or maybe a subcommittee of that committee, which reports to the committee, and you get the idea. And it's a construction project, so nothing ever goes as it's supposed to, right? You get the beautiful drawing from the architect, and it looks gorgeous, and that's as easy as it ever gets. After that, it is all an uphill slog of things going wrong. Like on the very first day of construction, they bring in the excavator and they dig down 6 feet and they find moving water because the water table on your land is so high. And the contractor says, "Oh, no one ever mentioned that before." Guess didn't know. Oh, I didn't know. I wasn't brand new. But anyway, you get the idea. And so by the time the project is in its middle portion, your building committee is just exhausted and overwhelmed of making decisions and everything going wrong and whatnot. And I would remind them that these are just compliments that Satan is giving to us by making this such a pain in the butt, just because he's afraid of what's going to happen, when this gets going. So in the same way, you can see Paul calls it out. Satan hindered Paul's plans. Paul wanted to go see this congregation face to face again. Although it's interesting, because I don't know if it's in this book or one of his other letters, but Paul mentions the fact that in person, he's far less impressive, that he's much more forceful when he writes. And that lets you know that Paul was an introvert. Because introverts are usually better with pen and paper than they are speaking in person, face to face, okay? But anyway, just, when Satan hinders a church's plans, again, they're just merely compliments because he's worried about how God is going to use that church. And when we have our plans hindered, again, while Satan can hinder our plans, he can never hinder, thwart, alter, or change God's plans. So this did not work out the way that Paul wanted it to work out, but it did work out the way that God wanted it to work out, if that makes any sense. All right, chapter 3. Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are destined for this. For when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass, and just as you know. All right, so Paul can't make it in person, so what does Paul do? Paul sends Timothy. Now remember, in these days, this is how pastors were trained. This is very much like our modern day apprentice system. I think I've used that comparison before. So when you have a young fella who wants to get into a trade, what he will do is he'll join and become an apprentice for that trade. And he will work alongside more experienced folks, whether it's a journeyman or a master. Again, not having gone through this process, I may be oversimplifying it, and if I am, please correct me. But that's just how pastors were trained in this day and age in the church. I mean, this was the very first generation of the church, and they simply took the method, the system that they knew, and that's what they utilized, right? In the Jewish church, which Paul was, again, very familiar with, he was at one point in time a leader in the Jewish church. He was a Pharisee. And so how that worked to train a new rabbi is that you'd have an existing rabbi, and he would have with him a group of students, disciples, and they would follow him and learn from him, and eventually, when he thought that they were ready, they would then become rabbis. And so it was just this hands-on way of teaching. And so this is the same way then that pastors were trained. You would have several younger fellas, Timothy and Titus, would travel with Paul, would be trained by Paul, and then Paul eventually would then send them out and give them different tasks. So that's just, two of the younger pastors, Timothy and Titus, that we encounter in the New Testament, learning from the Apostle Paul. Paul, most likely, in our day and age, we would give him a formal title of an associate pastor. Paul wound up serving and staying at the church in Ephesus. And then as he left, Ephesus was in modern-day Turkey. And then when he began his missionary journeys, it was the elders and the leaders of the church of Ephesus that kind of met with him and commissioned him on his way. So we would say that he was basically an associate pastor or a missionary pastor at the church of Ephesus, who was then sent out on his missionary journeys. All right. The fact that we are going to suffer for our faith is going to surprise no one, because this is just simply what the Lord has told us is in store, right? Satan and the world, they hate God most of all, but they are powerless to do anything against God, right? So what's the next best target? Where do they misdirect their anger to? The people who follow the Lord. Goodness sakes, you can't read the news on any day about our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who suffer pretty extreme persecution. I just read about hundreds of Christians in the Congo who were murdered. And so every year, the estimate is about 100,000 Christians are killed for their faith around the world. We don't see it here in our church in North America, but certainly in African countries, Middle Eastern countries, where you have a larger Islamic population, there tends to be a great deal of persecution of God's church. In Paul's day, since this was the Roman world, the persecutions would kind of ebb and flow. To be honest, they weren't too horrible under Paul. They would get a lot worse a few years later. John, do you know off the top of your head, was it Was it Claudius who began?
No,
And then Domitian. All right.
That was the first
Right.
formal, established effort of persecution of Christians. It happened a little bit with Nero, but that was more sporadic and due to his mental stability or instability, depending on what was going on, and things like that. But Domitian implemented he was the first one to implement
Do you know of a time frame on that one?
Yeah, it would have been in like the 90s AD.
Okay.
That doesn't mean things weren't happening prior.
Right.
Producing something, there's always going to be opposition.
Sure.
Where it was an empire-wide, it was under Domitian, pogrom or whatever you call it.
Yep. That wound up being quite a divisive issue later on in the church, as the persecutions by Rome would increase. Rome eventually made you sign some kind of a formal document, renouncing your faith, and if you didn't, then you were persecuted. And you'd have some Christians who would sign it just to avoid the persecution, even though in their heart they still believed. And then you had some people who wouldn't sign it, and they were tortured, had their property confiscated, their lives upended and turned upside down. And then when the persecution was over, then you had all the folks who avoided the persecution want to come back into the church. And then the folks who didn't avoid the persecution were a little salty. Is how we would say it these days. And so that was a big, because the church eventually called the folks who signed that document, they called them the lapsed. And so when the lapsed wanted to return, then you had the folks who had stayed and endured the persecution were unhappy, and many of them unwilling to welcome back these folks. You see it sometimes, obviously to a much lesser extent, but during a vacancy in a congregation, you will have folks that just disappear, and they kind of avoid any of the difficulties and struggles that go on during a vacancy. But then when the settled pastor comes, then they'll reappear, which is a good thing. Yes. All right. But sometimes you get folks who will say, oh, hey, you skipped the hard part and came back for the good part. And it's, it is our human nature at times to want to avoid suffering, or just whatever it is, whether it's taking time to mourn the loss of a pastor that you really liked, whatever it might be, but it is very common. And I imagine at Peace you'll see the same thing, that once Pastor Jim is installed and is here for a few months, you'll get some folks who wandered away, drifted away to come back. And my encouragement is always to welcome them back with open arms, even if they had missed having to endure the half-hour to 45-minute sermons that Pastor Kurt would give every Sunday, and only come for the 20-minute sermons that Pastor Jim will give.
How do you know that for sure?
I am putting the best construction on my neighbor's actions. And it's his wife that's got to sit on the 3 kids by herself while he's up there. And so, although they're past the age when you kind of had to sit on them and keep them,
Yeah, they're at the age where you got to make sure they still.
Yeah. All right. So one of the reasons that Paul would frequently commend the Thessalonians and lift them up and praise them was indeed their perseverance of enduring this kind of suffering and still holding on to their faith. And it's very interesting because, and you all can weigh in on this as well, when you think of people that have fallen away from the church, has it been something catastrophic, or has it been a lot more subtle? Both? How so? Can you give an example? And I would agree with you. I've experienced both. But in my personal experience, far less people leave the church because of something catastrophic, some big loss, tragedy, whatnot. Every once in a while it happens, but not often. More often than not, people will leave the church simply because they get out of the habit. It's a gentle drifting away. That's kind of what COVID wound up doing. Folks will say that COVID caused, because most churches lost about 25 to 30% of their weekly attendance after COVID. And really what COVID did was just kind of accelerate a trend that was already happening. But you just had families who they weren't angry or hurt or didn't have a big crisis in their life. They simply just got out of the habit of coming every Sunday.
One thing too is that during COVID, everybody went to our live streaming.
Yeah.
And there are people that, it's easier just to sit home and watch and listen to the sermon instead of have to get ready and go to church and come back. But
yep.
They miss the camaraderie that we have here. It's just.
Well, the fellowship that strengthens, group type of.
And the sacraments as well. Yep. But I interrupted, and I apologize. I always forget your first name, Jenny. All right, you're used to me interrupting, but I will try not to. But I asked, did you have examples of folks that?
If something happened in the church and they didn't agree with how it was handled.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Then that can cause a lot.
Theological issues.
Sometimes it's not even theological issues.
Like when we were at church, they had a school and everything.
Yeah.
They did not agree with how things were handled at the school.
Yep.
Certain families would get treated different than other families and stuff, and that caused a lot of conflict.
Mm-hmm. But did they leave the church in general, or just that congregation?
Some, and some left because they didn't, when you're.
And now I served for a church that had a school for 21 years, so I understand. I get it. Yep.
When you're told, and if you're at that church and you grew up in that church for so long, and things are instilled in you. This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. You don't go to movies. You don't drink. You don't drink. You don't dress this way. You don't. But you see some other families in the church doing this. But the people that are trying to stay true, they mess up once, you get hammered. You just turn your back towards that kind of stuff, and you don't go to church, or you go some other church that doesn't have those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can create a lot of hard feelings.
Sure.
And it's not necessarily. Sometimes it's not hard feelings towards the church itself, it's the people in it. And then more problems happen, and you see all those people in that church scattering, and then you see them out in town. We don't go to that church no more. Then they come back together. It's just different. It's lots of things can happen.
Yep, but I would also say that it's not unusual, right? Again, this is how Satan works.
And you look at all those situations, and the only thing that hasn't changed is God.
Yep.
the people have changed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, different churches are different, but it's the same God.
Yep.
And so it's not God in the Bible changing, it's people, the way that they're
And
teaching people and the way that, you know, what they believe is right and wrong, but it's not in the Bible. You know what I mean?
yes, ma'am. And, you know, if we were to read a different letter of Paul, he would be admonishing a church like the church in Corinth, because one of the things that happened there is they did give in to these divisions and they had factions within the church. And so you had this wonderful example of dysfunction in a church from like the very beginning. And it always made me feel better when I would look at the dysfunction in my church and say, oh, all right, this is nothing new. This has been around since there have been churches. And I would imagine if you would look in the synagogues, even the Jewish gatherings that predate Christianity, you would have dysfunction in them as well, because, well, that's what happens when you get a group of sinful people gathered together.
Before you go on, I think when you asked me that question, did I say Diocletian?
Yes,
I meant Domitian.
Domitian.
Diocletian was way later, in the late 200 AD.
Chief of sinners though you be.
Yeah.
Wow. All you got to do is just say it with confidence, and none of us are going to know that.
In your 70s, you make more. More of those sins. Remember,
You're not making me hold out hope.
not Diocletian was later. He was, in fact, the last emperor just before Constantine came to power. He was the last emperor to have
A formal
program of
persecution.
Domitian.
Well, this at least had good news at the end of this first of the section, because, you know, Paul is writing this, right?
Right.
And he's worried that, oh boy, this has been kind of left in the lurch, and maybe there's nobody left that's faithful. And it's sort of an encouraging little thing, you know, that he was just worried that I couldn't stand it any longer, as mine should. I could stand it no longer. I wanted to find out.
Yep.
Are you still going?
Verse 5, for this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you, and our labor would be in vain. Which is also interesting, because Paul knows in his head, right, that our labor is not in vain. Even when our eyes see brokenness and dysfunction. And that was what heartened me, because the first church that I served, I would have put the people drama probably at a 7 or an 8 out of 10. There was a high level of people drama. And you would say, how can anything go on and happen in the midst of this kind of dysfunction? This group is fussing at that group, and every Sunday in the parking lot, you've got this meeting over here and this meeting over there, and and you're like, this must be impossible for God to work any good out of this. And yet, every year, what would happen? God would work some kind of good. There would be families who were not aware of all the dysfunction. They just came to worship or go to school, and God was able to bless them. And so we know in our heads that our labor is not in vain, that God does work in spite of us, even in the midst of our brokenness and us getting it wrong all of the time. God can still work, and God can still wind up, making things to be a blessing for his kingdom. But again, and this just reminds us that if you would ask Paul, in your head, do you know that our labor is not in vain? And the answer, of course, is absolutely. We know that. This just reminds me that he was human. That he was worried that maybe there's nothing left, and everything that we endured in that spot was, for nothing, even though our fruit and of what we see is not the best indication. Contrast Noah and Jonah, right? Noah worked on the ark for 100 years. He's building this giant boat in the middle of dry ground. There had to have been people who wandered by and said, "What in the world are you doing, you madman?" And he would have the chance to say and talk to them, "Hey, God has commanded us," and, to warn them and whatnot. And Noah converted in 100 years. Noah changed the minds of what? Absolutely no one. Zero. Okay? And he was faithful for 100 years at that. Jonah, when he eventually gets to the city of Nineveh, even though he doesn't want to, even though he hates the fact that he is warning this people to change, what happens? In like 3 days, the whole city, from the king on down, they repent. And so you have Noah faithfully plugging away at this task for 100 years and zero, not one convert. Jonah grudgingly, "Ruth, I hate you. I hope you ignore me, but if you don't change, God's going to rain fire down upon you." And the whole city from the king on down repents. And so you just, again, what you see with your eyes is never going to be the accurate reflection of what God is doing and how God is working. Because you can even look back into your own life, and you can look at the things and said, "Yep, I absolutely screwed that up." But in the same time, you can probably see and find a way that God has worked through that. And maybe if it's even just giving you some wisdom or a different perspective or a little more patience when someone else screws up. I mean, it's one of my favorite sayings, because I'll get folks, readers especially, they'll screw up a reading and they'll come afterwards and they'll apologize that I messed this up. And I'm like, brother or sister, you make 10,000 more mistakes and you'll begin to catch up with me. All right. Because I have made them all. And so I shouldn't say that. There's probably some that I haven't yet made that I will learn and will make. But you get the idea that even in spite of us, God continues to work and grow and grow His kingdom, and His plans are never thwarted. All right, let's continue chapter 3 now, beginning at verse 6. But now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us the good news of your faith and love, and reported that you always remember us kindly and long to see us as we long to see you. For this reason, brothers, in all our distress and affliction, we have been comforted about you through your faith. For now we live, if you are standing fast in the Lord. For what thanksgiving can we return to God for you, for all the joy that we feel for your sake before our God, as we pray most earnestly night and day, that we may see you face to face and supply what is lacking in your faith. So now remember, Paul he wasn't married, he's got no children. So think about the joy as a parent that you have with your adult children, your grown children, who are faithful, who are strong in their walk with the Lord. And contrast that to the fear that you have for your grown children that aren't. And I can tell you, as a guy who has a couple of both, you can see the worry that Paul has, and the joy that he has, knowing that through all of this, these folks have been faithful. And at the same time, think about what it does to the morale of a congregation when you can see the fruit that God has produced through you all. If anyone was able to be here when Alex Kaufman was ordained, what a joyful celebration that was, because you got to see with your own eyes this fruit, this way that God was growing his kingdom and blessing the kingdom through you all. And so that is always a great thing. And of course, there's no congregation that gets it 100% right, okay?
It's made up of people.
It's made up of people. And so, Paul, and this is, something interesting for us to understand as well. When Paul says he wants to come and supply what is lacking in their faith. As Christians, our attitude should never be, hey, we've arrived. Our attitude should always be, even when you're 92 years old, you still, you can still grow. You can still get better. He just happened to be the oldest one here, so I was just... All right.
One of the things I think one ought to remember when you're reading these are letters. And so we don't know really what it was the problem in both cases. And I think maybe in our beginning we didn't get the right message, because I thought we maybe, it leaves a lot of questions in your mind. And so we don't want to let those questions drive us away from the main thing.
Right.
So what I'm trying to say is, when I read this, I can't say this. Well, what can I take from these words? And we always have questions. We don't know what it was. To them, the people that he was writing to, this would have made a lot more sense than us trying to figure out what was the real problem. But it's something we have to keep in mind when we're reading in the epistles.
I agree. But at the same time, I also think that, you can see some commonalities that are going to be in every congregation. In my role as the vacancy guy now in my fourth congregation, I've got to see these wonderful groups of believers in every congregation, and I've got to meet some unhappy campers in every congregation, and I've got to see where God has, really blessed these group of people, and I've got to see where, okay, there's some areas that we can grow in our faith. And I think the same thing can be true when we read the epistles. That I agree with Ted that we're never going to understand it as well as the folks who this was written to. But at the same time, God has it in the scriptures for a reason, for us to be able to learn and grow. Let's just finish out chapter 3 real quick before we have to go. Now may our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus direct our way to you, and may the Lord make you increase and abound in love for one another and for all, as we do for you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus with all his saints. And obviously, I'm going to be drawn probably to the same verse that you all are, verse 12, about the Lord making you increase and abound in love for one another and for all. And as a pastor of a congregation, and I would probably say as a member, just a member of a congregation, that this is the attitude that you would hope for. Not that there's going to be peace, love, and joy and harmony throughout a congregation, but that it abounds in love for each other and for everyone that the Lord brings in through the door. All right. Hey, another chapter.
It was sort of an encouraging one.
Hopefully.